This is episode 381 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Scott Newstock, author of How to Think Like Shakespeare. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
In Shakespeare's King Lear, the title character laments, "Break, heart, I prithee, break!" A poignant expression of profound emotional anguish. But could heartbreak actually have tangible physical effects? Modern medicine recognizes Takotsubo Syndrome, or broken heart syndrome, as a condition where extreme emotional stress leads to temporary heart muscle dysfunction. Intriguingly, Shakespeare's works often depict characters experiencing intense emotional turmoil, sometimes culminating in death. In this episode, we explore the intersections between 16th century understandings of the heart, Shakespeare's dramatic portrayals of heartbreak, and contemporary medical insights into Takotsubo Syndrome. Our guests, Dr. Breed Phillips and Dr. Claire Hansen, share their research, which offers a unique perspective on the physiological and emotional dimensions of heartbreak in Shakespeare's plays, bridging historical stories and modern medicine. Dr. Breed Phillips is a scholar specializing in early modern studies with a focus on the interplay between color, emotion, and Shakespeare's drama. Her interdisciplinary approach combines literary analysis with insights from the health, humanities, and nursing, examining how emotions are represented and understood in early modern texts. Dr. Claire Hansen is a lecturer in English literature whose research encompasses Shakespeare studies, health humanities, and the integration of literature into medical education. Her work often explores how literary narratives can inform and enhance our understanding of health and emotional well-being. Together, Dr. Phillips and Dr. Hansen co-authored the article Wilt, Break My Heart, Takotsubo Syndrome, and Shakespeare's Discourses of Heartbreak in Antony and Cleopatra and King Lear, published in the journal Shakespeare in April of 2024. Their collaborative research offers a unique perspective on the physiological and emotional dimensions of heartbreak in Shakespeare's works. Before we dive into today's conversation, I want to let you know about the bonus material available for today's show for patrons. This can be found at CassidyCash.com/episode 381, and patrons can access all the extras while you listen to the show. This includes visual representations and diagrams that explain Takotsubo Syndrome, historical context on 16th century medical beliefs about the heart and emotions, along with additional resources and readings recommended by our guests. If you're not yet a patron, you can join us and gain access to these materials right now by clicking any of the Patreon buttons available on our show notes page. Again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/EP381. And now let's dive into the history. Hello, Breed and Claire. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Thank you for having us.
It's absolutely lovely to be here.
Let's start with the medical side of things. What exactly is Takotsubo Syndrome, and how did it come to be known as broken heart syndrome?
Well, I'm just going to lead with the answer on this one because this has fascinated me for a while. The syndrome itself the term was first coined in 1990, which I find fascinating in itself because that's really quite recent in medical terms. So there was a Japanese cardiologist in Hiroshima, and he first recognized and reported this concept of the Takotsubo cardiomyopathy in 1990. And since then, it's become recognized worldwide. But it's called Takotsubo because it takes its name from its appearance. So in your heart, and for those listening, I've got just my hand in a fist. The left ventricle is the biggest part of your heart. And in this syndrome, at the apical end of the ventricle, it becomes like swollen. It sort of balloons out a little bit. So when this cardiologist was looking at this, he noticed that it took on the appearance of the Japanese octopus fishing pot. And that's what the Takotsubo refers to. So if you're, into your literary studies like I am, I imagine that this octopus and all of its tentacles is forcing emotions around, which are distorting and impeding the amazing work of this left ventricle. But that's creative license. We think that it works slightly differently today. So, this can be a transient cardiomyopathy. So it's often reversible. It can resolve in days or weeks, but there are occasionally acute complications. So it isn't a syndrome to be taken lightly. It is a cardiac syndrome which needs to be fully treated and fully managed. Although we still are working out exactly the pathophysiology of this syndrome. So we do know, though, that it is often an emotionally stressful situation that triggers this syndrome, which is interesting and which is what led us to sort of think back to more historical times around how this was portrayed. So we have the symptoms that we know today of chest pain, shortness of breath, what we call in the medical terms syncope, which is fainting, and we get that adrenaline response, the fight or flight. So these are often things that people report around experiencing Takotsubo syndrome.
Claire, Breed is explaining here a lot of symptoms that we know about today, but obviously this kind of thing would have been happening in Shakespeare's lifetime, because even though the understanding of it is new, the existence is not. But Shakespeare's audience didn't know the term cardiomyopathy, of course. So what did they believe about how emotion affected the body, particularly the heart?
I mean, you're right, exactly, that this would have occurred long before we gave it a modern name of Takotsubo syndrome. So early modern people, Shakespeare's audience, would recognize heartbreak as a physiological event centuries before Takotsubo syndrome was coined, as Breed said, in 1990. So essentially, Breed and I think that Shakespeare's audience understood that emotion could absolutely affect the body and especially the heart, which is what we're focusing on. So in their view, in their perspective, it's particularly excess or extreme emotion. That's the problem here. So excess emotion or intense emotion puts too much pressure on the heart, and that's dangerous. And that's where you get that kind of what Breed was describing, that octopus squished into that space. And
I don't want an octopus in my chest. I mean, I can say.
Can I just say that is not reported in any of the medical journals at all? That just comes from my imagination.
I think very literary Shakespeare would be proud of having a picture of what's going on inside.
Yeah, it's a lovely metaphor, which I think we'll probably come to later. So this idea of this metaphorical octopus in your heart, and it's too much pressure. And that's not a good idea. You don't want to let that kind of pressure build up in the heart, right? So the understanding in Shakespeare's day was that kind of pressure needed to be alleviated in some way, generally through things like crying or potentially speaking. Shakespeare uses a couple of really interesting words to help us understand this. He uses the words o'erfraught and o'ercharged to describe what Suyatha Iyengar has defined as being overfilled, overburdened by external burden. So that might be, say, if you've got too much food in your stomach, but also emotional triggers. So this sense that you can be overcharged by an emotional event or an emotional stressor. Iyengar writes in her book, Shakespeare's Medical Dictionary, that particular body parts could become flooded or overcharged by humours under strong affections. So these strong feelings, she writes, needed purging from the body. So a purging, an evacuation, a bloodletting, they might be options, but her argument is that they're actually not necessary, that there were actually natural outlets that you could use instead. So that's, as I mentioned before, tears, sweating, even urine, belching, or what Shakespeare argues is words as this way to alleviate pressure. So Iyengar writes that words, in Shakespeare's view, could vent feelings in a healthy way and prevent death, prevent cracked heartstrings, so prevent that broken heart. So that's the early modern take on it. And we see this in early modern medical treatises as well. They're highly alert to the role of emotions when it comes to the health of the heart. So I'll just give you one example. 1590, Philip Barrett publishes The Method of Physic. And in that, he suggests that cardiac issues encompass outward symptoms as well as inward causes and emotional concerns. So he gives a list of physical symptoms that Bree described earlier in relation to Takotsubo syndrome. So things like syncope, fainting as an outward symptom. But he also talks about emotions. He says fear, dread, and all such like perturbations of the mind could lead to a failing of the heart. So you can see there in Shakespeare's day, there's a very clear link between emotions, particularly excess emotions or extreme emotions, and damage to the heart, potentially fatal damage. So what we take away from this is a belief that emotions, and we focus mainly on the negative, but it's probably worth saying that sometimes excess positive emotions, so too much joy, for example, can actually damage the heart. So the key for early moderns is moderation. So nothing in excess, and also actually social interactions as a key way to ameliorate this. So avoiding extreme emotion, communicating with the people around you as a way of reducing that pressure, letting that octopus out of the heart.
It's really interesting to me that there's an awareness. When we think of broken heart syndrome, I think we turn towards, lost love or like a sadness as what we think of as broken heart syndrome. But that quote from the Method of Physic in the 1590s seems to have an understanding of it being possible for people to be scared to death, for example, where they are filled with so much fear and dread, the quote said, where they're scared of something so much that their heart stops working. So it is not just, they were sad and lonely, but anything that was too much could lead to this kind of complication.
Yeah, I think that's right, Cassidy. I think it's less the type of emotion and more how much of it there is. So yeah, if there's just too much going into the heart, too much pressure, even if it's joy or if it's fear, whatever, it's not healthy. You're right there. I think it's less about not necessarily lost love being, more inclined to give you heartbreak, but just anything that's excessive.
In King Lear, we hear the quote, "Break heart, I prithee break." Is that just a metaphor that Shakespeare's using there, or does it reflect something people of the time could think, this might actually happen?
Absolutely, more than metaphor. More than metaphor. I mean, first off, it's assumed in King Lear that Kent, at the end of the play, dies of a broken heart. And of course, we have Gloucester, whose heart is said to burst at his death as well. So we know that breaking hearts can be literal events in King Lear and of course beyond the play. What I would add to that as kind of a caveat is I think metaphor's complex here, and it's a complex thing across Shakespeare's plays. I tend to always go back to Simon Palfrey's take on metaphors, which he refers to as little worlds. He reminds us that metaphors aren't a simple thing. It's not just a matter of one thing standing for another in Shakespeare. In Palfrey's view, the purpose of metaphor is not to find out what is already known, but to discover, he says, what might be present. It is its own barometer of possibility, he says. And I really like that recognition that metaphors are living, dynamic, complex things in Shakespeare. And when it comes to the body, we have to keep in mind that metaphors can also be derived from bodily processes. So there's this complex slippage between the literal and the figurative for early modern thinkers. So when it comes to hearts in Shakespeare, it's not just metaphor, but I think Breed and I would also caution against a kind of black and white understanding of it having to be either literal or figurative. I think it's complex, and there's slippage across that sort of continuum, I suppose. In the context of medical discourse around cardiac health, I think the role of metaphor is really significant. Two really interesting writers, Darrell Chalk and Mary Floyd Wilson, have written on it, and they say that the early modern, what they call slippage from the metaphorical material and from the figurative to the literal, is a common feature of writings about contagious phenomena. So they're talking about health, early modern health as well, not specific to hearts, but they recognize this kind of movement across from the metaphorical to the literal, and a tendency for the literal and the figurative to meld in the period. I think what's important to keep in mind here is that we're not sort of putting that sort of black and white split between them. And when you think about metaphors in medicine and literature, there's a really interesting relationship. A couple of authors that we quote in our article talk about kind of a co-constitutive relationship between the discourses of medicine and literature, that each language helps the other. So living, existing metaphors can limit or enable the development of medical ideas, while medical ideas as they are discovered over time enable the development of new metaphor as well. So there's sort of this nice crossover between the two. And I think if readers are interested, there's a really interesting author, W.W. Slights, who writes on the heart in the age of Shakespeare. And he talks about how the physician and the anatomist in the early modern period began to create this language of psychophysiology that could be appropriated for dramatic characters, while the drama provided this concept of power that could explain the hierarchy of, say, organs in the body. So Slights talks about this crossover. When we're talking about hearts in King Lear, and whether they're literal or broken hearts in King Lear, we know that this play is very much preoccupied with hearts, with about 60 references to hearts across the course of the play. There's some really nice examples, and I'll talk about just a couple of them today. So in both of these examples, you get this sense that the health of one person's heart can impact or influence another. So it comes back to this point that I made earlier about contagion, this sense that heart health might actually be something that is contagious in the early modern thinking. So let's talk about Edgar and his father Gloucester, because this is a really lovely example. So towards the end of the play, Edgar is describing the death of his father Gloucester, and he mentions twice this image of a bursting heart, suggesting this kind of contagious heartbreak that could first infect the father and then endanger the son. He also talks about kind of wishing that his own heart would burst. And he says, describing his father, but his flawed heart, alack too weak the conflict to support, twixt two extremes of passion, joy and grief, burst smilingly. So you get here what we've been talking about quite a bit today already, this idea of extremity of emotion, right? Two extremes. So he had too much of both joy and grief to survive, which I find absolutely fascinating. But also this repetition of the burst heart being something that, because his father has suffered, Edgar is aware might happen to himself. The other example that I wanted to mention from Lear is the relationship between Lear and Kent, which I think has some really fascinating moments in terms of what Breed and I refer to as inter-heart dynamics, the sense that hearts can affect each other. So you might remember, it's quite a famous moment in Lear, when Kent asks Lear to enter shelter to escape the rough and open night in the third act. Lear asks Kent, "Wilt break my heart?" And Kent replies, "I had rather break mine own." So you get this sense of the connection between hearts. And later, you get a really interesting textual crux, which further connects the hearts of Lear and Kent. So in the folio, when Lear dies, Kent says, "Break heart, I prithee break." But the quarto gives that line to Lear. So it's a really interesting moment where even sort of textually, their hearts are getting a little bit mixed up. And so we know that Lear's death could potentially be diagnosed as due quite simply to a broken heart. And we also know that Kent, as I said before, is assumed to have died literally of a broken heart. So we see these literal examples operating as evidence in Lear that damage done to one heart can, I think, damage another. So it's a really interesting investigation into heart dynamics across King Lear.
In their publication on this topic, Breed and Clare wrote about Antony and Cleopatra, a play filled with passion, despair, and of course, dramatic death. What did you see in that story from a medical perspective that led you to associate it with broken heart syndrome as it might have manifested in the 16th century?
Well, I think in this play particularly, as opposed to, where you might see broken hearts in other plays across the Shakespearean corpus, for us, it was the death of those minor characters that sparked the association initially. So I'm talking about the cases of Enobarbus and Eras. So those are characters who are in an inferior status or work in a servile capacity or an adjunct to the main character, So it sort of underlines the fact that this is a disease or a syndrome or a situation not only of the upper classes, it can affect anyone, So like any health issue, even in modern times, and especially in modern times, the social determinants of health play a big part. And this is played out in the play Antony and Cleopatra. And obviously, my play on words is absolutely using the word play to excess, but we're going to move past that. So I'm just going to outline what the social determinants of health are if you're not familiar. So these are accepted nowadays as the non-medical factors that influence how your health outcomes are going to play out, your longevity of life, all of those things. And what we are talking about here are the conditions in which people are born, in which they're educated, they grow, they live, they work, their age. So all of those things around you in your own social circumstances play a big part in your own health outcomes. So I think this is something that we really should be thinking about when we're looking back at these plays, because when we look at these two characters, they're minor characters, they're the ones that you can consider or as a possibility of dying from broken hearts. So Enobarbus, who is Antony's confidant and lieutenant, he's a rational, often oracular type of person. You know, he warns of that the battle at sea will end in defeat before it happens. But he eventually deserts Antony for Octavius. Now, Antony, in maybe goodwill, shall we say, sends all Enobarbus' goods to him despite this betrayal. And, you know, this potentiates Enobarbus' grief at his own disloyalty. He becomes really stricken with this grief, and his broken heart must be reconciled with this soldierly bearing. So he laments to himself, "This blows my heart. If swift thought break it not, a swifter mean shall outstrike thought. But thought will do it, I feel. I fight against thee, know I will go seek some ditch wherein to die. The foulest best fits my latter part of life." So here he's talking about, you know, his heart, what's going to break it, and how he feels all of these feelings. And, you know, he's going to take himself off somewhere to die. So he's absolutely convinced in his emotional distress brought on by the betrayal of his obligations to Antony, that it's going to be his heart that suffers the most. This, when you look back at it, is actually quite crystal clear. When you read those lines, when you think of his situation, it's very clear that the early moderns possibly understood this heartbreak to be an affliction. And this is an affliction that was suffered by traitors. So it's across the social continuum that it's happening. So what happens with Enobarbus is he recognizes the potential damage to his heart. Like he says, "This blows my heart." But he wants to incite further damage to self-punish. You know, he's really wants this punishment to be continued. So he doesn't seek a remedy. He doesn't have anyone to offer him care or comfort. And he looks for neither, you know, internal strength or external comfort. And, you know, his words, he wishes that life, a very rebel to my will, may hang no longer on me. Throw my heart against the flint and hardness of my fault, which, being dried with grief, will break to powder and finish all foul thoughts. So we have him very, very explicitly describing his own heartbreak. You know, the driest heart is ready to break, and this grief has claimed his damaged heart. And we have this writer, Nicholas Kofutu, who says that the heart shrinks up and freezes with grief. So we have this sense of the heart becoming frozen or shrunken, and suggests this change and of moisture levels. So we have this idea of heartbreak as this condition which can cause death, but it's also here conflated with sort of humoral concerns as well. So with Enobarbus in the play, his heart can't support him anymore, and we find that he swoons and possibly dies. This is not explicitly described. He's not a main character, but we can envisage that his heart, emotionally overstrained, fatally breaks in this condition. He's suffering this huge amount of shame and guilt. And his description of what's happening to him really does align with that early modern medical understanding of heartbreak. And he has removed himself from the idea or the actuality of comfort and care. And this leads to his demise. So the second character that I mentioned, Iris, now she reputedly expires from grief. You know, she knows that her mistress is preparing to die. So, you know, Cleopatra is ever dramatic and she bids her loyal servants a final goodbye. And in that moment, we have Cleopatra commanding her own sort of demise. And for me, I mean, there's many opportunities to see the play, but for me, it's a very dramatic, you know, center stage. I'm about to die and scene. But we'll neglect those servants, you know, who are surrounding her, who have devoted their lives to her. And, you know, some scholars suggest that Iris simply dies of grief. So we know that to die of grief is wrapped up in that idea of being heartbroken. So Iris has devoted herself to Cleopatra. She's obligated by bounds of duty and care to provide this comfort. But she comes from a lower socioeconomic class. She doesn't have emotional support. She doesn't have care and comfort. And her physical body succumbs in this time of huge distress. Cleopatra performs the embodiment of the symptoms of the broken heart. She has fainting. She's short of breath. Undo my stays, you know. I'm thinking you shouldn't have worn that in the first place, Cleopatra. It was too tight for you. But, you know, she's performing what she knows to be heartbreak, but it's not heartbreak that kills her in the end. She has people looking after her, undoing the stays and making sure that she is comfortable. And we find in other areas, like for instance, Caesar looks after his sister Octavia, who is quite upset about her marital situation has gone west in the play. She's quite distressed and distraught. So Caesar urges her to cheer your heart. He specifically mentions her heart when he's trying to bring her comfort. And he hopes that she will have the best of comfort and ever welcome to us, because he wants to lighten her mood, provide her with physical comfort and care, because this will relieve the distresses of her heart.
I feel like there's bound to be some connection there between the British stereotype, I guess, of having, you know, a stiff upper lip, and we don't talk about our emotions. We don't discuss our problems. Everything is kept close to the vest in that way. So
yes, push it down and let it fester.
Well, besides Lear and Antony and Cleopatra, are there other characters who show signs of broken heart syndrome, even if it's not explicitly described in the way that we've managed to quote some of these characters as pointing out?
Absolutely. There are so many references to Shakespeare's characters expressing a concern that intense or excess emotion may damage their hearts. It's so common that it's commonly understood and I think read as metaphor, which of course it can be. But as we've said before, this is also reflective of an early modern understanding of how emotion could affect the heart. So if you'll indulge me, Cassidy, I've got a few quotes that I might just share now.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
If there's anything we love here, it's Shakespeare quotes. So go ahead.
Can't avoid it. So this is more about characters talking about the potential for heartbreak rather than characters actually experiencing it. So start with a really, really famous example. Let's start with Hamlet. When Hamlet complains of the frailty of his mother in her over-hasty marriage to her dead husband's brother, he predicts, "It is not, nor it cannot come to good, but break my heart, for I must hold my tongue." So immediately and quite clearly there, we see the link between keeping things in, so that kind of stiff upper lip, I suppose, in some ways, and how dangerous that is for your heart. So at this point, Hamlet is not doing what Antony and Cleopatra did, as Brie has so beautifully explained, getting that support, alleviating that discomfort, but keeping it all inside. We see something similar in Macbeth as well. Malcolm advises Macduff to prevent heartbreak. He says, "Give sorrow words. The grief that does not speak whispers the o'erfraught heart and bids it break." Same thing if we jump to the comedies and we look at Kate in Taming of the Shrew. She's also very aware of this same danger. She says, my tongue will tell the anger of my heart, or else my heart concealing it will break. And if we go back to another tragedy, Titus Andronicus's brother Marcus warns him, prepare thy aged eyes to weep, or if not so, thy noble heart to break. So that's a slightly different example. There, Titus is being advised that you need to cry at this to alleviate that pressure, whereas the previous examples are more about speaking. So again, we see Shakespeare offering these solutions to this problem of the overcharged heart. So this kind of brief kind of survey that I've just given of a few of Shakespeare's plays, I think speaks to the ubiquity of this discourse and really illuminates this belief that emotion not expressed, and there's a variety of ways in which you might express or alleviate it, could actually damage the heart. So you could argue that all of those are metaphorical examples. There's definitely an argument for that. But there are also examples outside of Lear and Antony and Cleopatra of more literal heartbreak. So we could turn to The Winter's Tale. You could make a case for Mamillius's death, so the son of Hermione and Leontes, as potentially a case of Takotsubo Syndrome. We're told by a servant, I shall be hated to report it, the servant says. The prince your son, with mere conceit and fear of the queen's speed, is gone. So fear, which we talked about before, being this driver for death. But then Hermione, understandably, faints at the news. And Leontes says, her heart is but overcharged. So again, you see this link, this idea of the overcharged heart coming into play at moments of extreme emotion. I think Bree and I both agree that there's probably a lot more work to be done in this space. We've looked at two plays, at King Lear, at Antony and Cleopatra, but there's so much room for exploring this fascinating phenomenon and this link between emotion and the heart. You could also look, dare I say it, beyond Shakespeare. There are a couple of plays that I'd point to, John Ford's The Broken Heart and 'Tis Pity She's a Whore, where you get different representations of hearts there too, and reactions to them. So I think there's just a world more to explore when it comes to heartbreak in Shakespeare and also in early modern drama more broadly.
We've been talking about specific symptoms, like Cleopatra calling for undo my stays. And then we've got the breathing and different things going on there as we're looking at that as evidence of Takotsubo syndrome. But were these symptoms understood in the 16th century from a medical perspective, or how did the medical community in Shakespeare's lifetime explain the relationship between heartbreak or grief and physical collapse?
So I think, as Claire highlighted earlier, like many of the early modern experts, they explained this relationship with the bridge of the emotions. So the emotions were essential when it came to the physicality of symptoms. So they were, like in modern sort of medicine, we're coming back together. We're bringing that sort of physical and emotional back together now because we can't really unpick it. But for a while in medical terms, we had separated those. But in the early modern medical treatises, there was no separation of the emotional and the physical. And I'm hoping that if we're encouraging quotations from Shakespeare, that we're happy to slip in a few from the early modern medical treatises. So we had Helkiah Crook, and he was writing in 1616, and he notes that the pulses, which are in anger, sorrow, and other passions, do sufficiently show that the heart and arteries are moved with the same motion. And when we're talking about motion, we're talking about the emotions here. So he continues, if when the heart is dilated, the arteries should be contracted, then in anger, the pulses should be small, in grief, great. Because in anger, the heart is somewhat contracted, and therefore the arteries should be but a little dilated. So that physical ebb and flow of whatever's happening in the heart and the arteries is very much predicated on the emotional state of the person. So for them, the collapsing when in distress and it's relating to your heart is absolutely congruent. There is no sort of dissonance in that thinking for the early modern medical writers at all. And one of my favorite writers, I'm sorry, I like to reel out my favorite writers at all time, Thomas Wright. He wrote about the passions of the mind in general. So he still is building on that relationship between heart, emotions, and then what happens to you as a person. So he says, the very common experience men try daily and hourly in themselves, for those who love it extremely and feeleth not that passion to dissolve his heart, who rejoice it and prove it not his heart dilated, who is moiled with heaviness or plunged with pain and perceiveth not his heart to be coarcted, whom inflameth ire and had not heart burning. So each emotion in his mind is delivering a physical state predicated on what's happening in your heart. So not only was the heart, that powerhouse of emotions, but for Wright and Crook and others, it was also altered by the passions. And therefore, that resulted in physical symptoms. So it's this complex heart, physical symptoms, emotional synergies that was totally accepted. And we're coming back to that today. Only since 1990 are we naming it, but we're definitely more aware and becoming more cognizant of that sort of psychological, emotional impact that the sort of life of the emotions has on the life of the physical person as well. So we find that Nicholas Kofatu, who I mentioned earlier as well, he talks about the emotions of joy and desire, where the heart melts with gladness, and in those of sorrow and trouble, it shrinks up and frees it with grief. And I mentioned this in relation to Enobarbus. So it's clear that any emotional state or condition which troubles the physical body requires that specialized treatment because it will affect your heart. So, not as sophisticated a diagnostic criteria as we would have nowadays, but definitely they were talking about the difficulty in breathing, the trembling of the heart, the beating of the pulse, fevers, cold. All of those symptoms were, named in their repertoire of what we should be looking for. So even though their understanding mightn't have in-depth pathophysiological scaffolding around it, their observations, I think, were actually very keen, which is just quite fascinating from this distance, isn't it?
This will require some conjecture, obviously, because we didn't get a signed affidavit from Shakespeare on this point, of course. But we've identified that the medical science was on point there. Now, they didn't have the scaffolding, as you mentioned. They don't have all the detail that we have now, but they had an understanding between the relationship of emotions and things as detailed as a dilation of arteries, which blows my mind because I think we like to think that they were really far removed from that kind of science in Shakespeare's lifetime, but they even understood an impact at that level. So if it's that broad, and we know that not only the medical community, but society and people at multiple class levels here were understanding this relationship, when we're seeing these characters dealing with heartbreak in Shakespeare's plays, do you think that Shakespeare had an understanding of this syndrome when he was writing these characters on purpose? Or are we applying this perspective retroactively because we know it now and we can look back and say, oh, that's what that was?
I mean, obviously, we can't describe thinking to Shakespeare. Yeah, you're absolutely right there. But if he's writing these characters in this way, these ways that are closely aligned to what we know medical treatises were saying at the time, it's not a big leap to suggest that this kind of thinking was commonplace. And that's, I think, what we can take from the plays and the conditions of the characters and their symptoms that they're talking about. So when we're saying signs and symptoms, they're describing what's happening to them. And that's actually definite on the paper. So when you're reading the text or watching the play, we can read what is happening to the characters. So I'm not sure that we can say he knew as much as Helkiah Crooke or Thomas Wright, but those writings were in circulation, and that thinking must have been commonplace enough, because if he's dramatizing those ideas on stage, he's writing for a popular audience. So he's hoping that his audience will understand what he's talking about. And we're assuming they did, because they went back for more. So from that point of view, I think we can assume that even if he wasn't specifically, I'm going to write heartbreak into this play, he was using the tools that were commonplace to make people understand what was happening to his characters.
I think the way that it's peppered through Shakespeare's plays in almost a casual way, dropped in briefly, and not necessarily the center of the narrative or the central point of a particular scene, but the way in these examples that we shared earlier, it is kind of just interwoven as kind of this assumed knowledge. I think that actually also tells us quite a bit as well, that Shakespeare is assuming that his audience will understand that very brief link between expression of emotion and the heart. I think that's sort of interesting evidence. Did Shakespeare know about Takotsubo syndrome or broken heart syndrome? No, we wouldn't be so bold to make that claim. And we are careful to avoid that sort of anachronistic claim. But in this case, I think early modern English culture knew more about heart health than we've previously given them credit for. And I think it's kind of humbling for us to sort of check some of that arrogance that there's this assumption that because of that distance, naturally we will know more. And that's not necessarily always the case. I think through Breed and our research into Takotsubo syndrome, heartbreak syndrome, alongside Shakespearean heartbreak, I think it's clear to us that both of these viewpoints are kind of mutually enlightened by this comparative analysis. And again, we're alert to the dangers of anachronism, and we've tried quite hard not to sort of collapse the medical discourse or collapse the cultural and actually religious differences as well across centuries, across cultures. I think what we would say is the history of heartbreak is more advanced than we might previously have suspected. And what I think is really interesting is that this kind of counters this teleological perspective of cardiac health and medicine and knowledge around the heart. And I think that's such a fascinating way of sort of troubling some of our scholarly assumptions. Especially interesting because, as Breed's pointed out, this is still something that's kind of unfolding today, that modern medicine is still, I think, getting their heads around Takotsubo syndrome.
We can't know for sure what Shakespeare's thinking, as you mentioned, but I think it, like so many things, and one of the things that I aim to highlight with what we do here on That Shakespeare Life is the idea that things going on in Shakespeare's plays are reflective of at least some level of an accepted mindset that was going on at the time he wrote the plays. And I think in this instance, with the stories of heartbreak, that's demonstrative through surviving medical records from there, as well as contemporary records. Even if we are going to non-Shakespeare plays for those records, there was an understanding about this syndrome, whether or not they had the terminology that we use for it today, which is intensely exciting to me. And I definitely, in context of people like William Harvey, who was publishing on the motion of the heart and blood in animals, right in the 17th century. And there was this huge science going on about it. So I think if we want to dive into this topic further, because there's obviously so much more to unpack, where should we begin if we want to look at this further?
So obviously, jokingly, you could go to our article. And the reason why I'm mentioning the article, which Cassidy will link for you, is there's an overview of what we've discussed today, but the reference list at the end of the article is quite comprehensive. So it includes the early modern record, but also modern interpretations. And I think it's a good place to start, to have that list for you. And I think some of the historical records around this time are also quite interesting. So we've mentioned a few. Philip Barra, he's quite interesting. He talks about the method of physic. But what is most interesting about the early modern record is the length of the titles of the books. So it is the method of physic containing the cases, signs, and causes of inward diseases in man's body from the head to the foot, whereunto is added the form and rule of making remedies and medicines, which our physicians commonly use at this day with the proportion, quantity, and names of each medicine.
Well, and there you go. And you have that memory. If you can't remember these titles, this is why we will have them in the show notes for you.
Yes, I think we often worry that our titles are too long. I think we are okay in ourselves if we go to 10 words. Philip certainly took a lot of creative license, but then you know exactly what the book is going to contain. So I like that too. So yes, those are places where you can start. I think they would be good, handy starting points.
These are fascinating records, and they are very exciting in all of their words. And we will list their complete titles and links to them so you can find them directly in the show notes for today's episode. So stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Now, Breed and Claire, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
Well, we've already got a complete works of Shakespeare, so that's much appreciated, and that would,
You're
I
welcome.
think, keep me very occupied on the deserted island. Yeah. So the book that I always love returning to is Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. That's weirdly for me a bit of a comfort read. I don't know if that's odd, but
that is my favorite book, of all time.
Okay, there we go.
Yes.
Oh, I'm glad I mentioned this. So yeah, it's just something about it. Like a mix of escapism. It's just such good storytelling. I don't know. It's just I like coming back to that as a comfort read. So that's what I would take with me. But I mean, I should say I do have Alexis Wright's new novel Praiseworthy. Am I getting that name right? On my bedside table, and I'm currently working my way through that. So that would actually also be a good addition because it's quite long. So keep you occupied for some time.
You'd be well set up, yes. And I think we can allow you to, so that'll be fine.
Thank you. I'm sorry I'm cheating.
Oh my gosh, cheaters. Right. Well, I'm taking 2 as well. I'm upgrading my thinking in fast forward. You can see the loading happening here. So
when I tell scholars that they have to only pick a book, I am prepared to allow more than one because I've already asked them to narrow it down to just one.
I know. So I had one in mind, which I'll come to in a second, but really, I love Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. It is so completely funny, and it is a comfort read. It's also, for me, tangibly emotional. It's the very first book that I read aloud to my 3 girls as a family thing, and they lapped it up. And when I say lapped it up, we had the Colin Firth video series of Pride and Prejudice on tape as well. That's how old this happened. So when we were reading Pride and Prejudice, we had to read the number of chapters to get up to that episode of the series. So they loved this television series, but they had to get through the chapters of the book. So again, it was this, exciting treat at the end. And I know I sound weird when a treat was an episode of Pride and Prejudice. That doesn't. Okay, moving on. We did other treats as well.
I actually still have that 7 tape set. I have that set in my house. I can't play it anymore because there's no such thing as a VHS player.
That's exactly right.
But it's there. So yeah, y'all both made excellent choices for your desert island selection. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Claire and I am with another colleague of ours, Michael Stevens. We're looking at, we're delving deep into a Shakespeare-related piece on the emotional effects of compassion on the heart, or vice versa. We're sort of really drilling into that critical idea at the moment. So it's a watch this space type of project, because we're at the very germinal stages, I would say as well, on that one.
Which is why it sounds so cryptic.
Well, and watch this space, we will, because we've been so excited to explore Takotsubo Syndrome, which I made it all the way till now saying correctly, and the way that that relates to Shakespeare. So we'll be excited to see what you come up with on the emotional effects of compassion. Thank you so much, Breed and Claire, for being here with us this week and helping us to understand this syndrome, how it existed in Shakespeare's lifetime, and how understanding that part of history makes Shakespeare's plays that much richer. We really appreciate you helping us make this connection.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
That concludes our exploration of heartbreak in Shakespeare's plays and its intriguing connections to modern medical understanding. A heartfelt thank you to Dr. Breed Phillips and Dr. Claire Hansen for sharing their interdisciplinary research with us in this exciting topic. Just a reminder, you can find more about our guests and access the resources mentioned in today's show, as well as explore related podcast episodes by visiting the show notes at CassidyCash.com/episode 381. Patrons can log in on that page to view our bonus content for today's show, including images and further information on Takotsubo Syndrome and its relevance to Shakespeare's plays. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. Until next time, may your curiosity lead you to new discoveries, your heart remain resilient, and your love for learning continue to flourish. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.